I was told my parents deserved to be homeless. So I took matters into my own hands. I'm 18 and still live with my parents. We've rented the same apartment for the past 10 years. It's not much, a 2-bedroom place with walls so thin I hear my parents whispering at night. It's home, though. At least it was. Until one day. It was a Thursday, and Mr. Novak, our landlord, came by unannounced. He's never done that before. Usually, he just mails the rent reminder or texts Mom if something needs fixing. This time, he stood awkwardly at the door, hat in hand, as if he knew his words were about to upend our lives. "I've decided to sell," he said. Just like that. Like he was talking about getting rid of an old couch instead of the place we've called home for a decade. "Your lease is up in 2 months, and I won't be renewing." "I'm sorry." Mom tried to reason with him, but his mind was made up. He'd gotten a good offer, and he wasn't going to wait. The rest of that day passed in a haze. I remember sitting on my bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, wondering what would happen to us. The next few days were tense. My parents talked in hushed tones, but I caught bits and pieces of their conversations. They didn't want to uproot me right before my final exams. They didn't want to move to a worse neighborhood. And most of all, they didn't want to rent anymore. "We've been saving," Mom said one night at dinner, her voice shaking but determined. "It's time we buy a place of our own." Dad looked hesitant. His health wasn't what it used to be, and he didn't like the idea of taking on a mortgage. But Mom was firm. They had some savings, and she'd been checking out affordable apartments nearby. It all seemed doable, until they calculated the down payment. They were $7,000 short. "We'll figure it out," Mom said, though I could see the worry in her eyes. She didn't sleep much after that. A week later, I heard Mom on the phone with her brother, Uncle Mark. I knew they weren't close, he hadn't even visited Dad when he was sick, but Mom was desperate. She explained everything: the landlord, the apartment, the savings, the shortfall. Mark didn't even let her finish. "Look, I can't help you," he said. "I'm starting my own business next month." Mom blinked, stunned. "You've been talking about starting a business for 2 years and haven't done anything yet. You have over $100,000 in savings, Mark. We're family." Mark sighed, the kind of sigh that said he was already done with the conversation. "Maybe you should have planned better. It's not my fault you've been renting for this long. You knew this day would come." Mom's voice cracked. "Mark, please. This isn't just about me. It's about your niece. Do you want us to end up homeless?" But Mark wouldn't budge. "You've been irresponsible. You deserve this. Maybe it'll teach you to manage your money better." I watched as Mom sat there, clutching the phone, tears streaming down her face. She didn't say another word before hanging up. Here's the thing about Mark. He lives rent-free with my grandmother. Ever since his divorce 5 years ago, he moved in with her and never left. Grandma doesn't charge him for anything, not even utilities. And the job he's so proud of? He only has it because of my dad. Years ago, Dad pulled strings to get Mark hired at a friend's company. It wasn't easy, but he believed in helping family. That's the kind of man my dad is. Even when he got sick, even when Mom was working 2 jobs to pay for his treatment, he never stopped being kind. Mark, though? He acts like he pulled himself up by his bootstraps. Like he doesn't owe anyone anything. I wish I could say I was surprised by his refusal, but I wasn't. What shocked me was how cruel he was about it. After that call, Mom stopped talking about Mark altogether. Dad tried to comfort her, but I could see the guilt eating away at him. He felt like this was all his fault. Like he'd failed us. We started looking for other options. Cheaper apartments, loans from banks, anything. But time was running out, and nothing worked. Every day, I watched my parents grow more defeated. Mom's face looked more tired than I'd ever seen it, and Dad stopped cracking the silly jokes he usually did to lighten the mood. "And Mark?" He went on as if nothing had happened. One night, I overheard Mom talking to Grandma on the phone. She didn't bring up Mark's refusal outright, but she hinted at it. Grandma, oblivious, just said, "Mark's been so busy lately, poor thing. Starting a business is so stressful. I wish I could do more for him." I clenched my fists so hard my nails left marks on my palms. Busy? Stressed? Mark had everything handed to him, and he still couldn't spare a dime for his own family. Last night was the worst. Mom and Dad sat me down at the kitchen table and told me they'd made a decision. "We're moving out of the city," Mom said. "What?" I stared at them, confused. "We can't afford anything here," Dad said quietly. "Your mom found a place a few hours away. It's smaller, but it's what we can afford." "What about school?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "You'll finish here," Mom said. "We'll figure out a way to commute for your exams." I wanted to scream. To tell them this wasn't fair. But I looked at their faces, and I couldn't. They were doing everything they could. They'd already sacrificed so much. Instead, I went to my room and cried. We have 6 weeks left before we have to leave. 6 weeks to pack up 10 years of memories and say goodbye to the only home I've ever known. I don't know how to feel. Angry? Sad? Betrayed? All of the above? I want to confront Mark. To make him see what he's done to us. But would it even matter? People like him don't care. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know one thing: I won't forget this. None of us will. I didn't want to go to Grandma's that day. Normally, I visited her once a week to check in, bring her groceries, and make sure she was doing okay. Uncle Mark, despite living with her for 5 years, never seemed to have the time for any of that. He didn't even bother pretending. But after everything that had happened, just being near him felt unbearable. Still, Grandma didn't deserve to be punished for her son's selfishness. So I went. When I arrived, Grandma was sitting in her usual spot at the kitchen table, sipping tea and working on a crossword puzzle. Her frailty seemed more pronounced than usual, her hands trembling slightly as she wrote. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her face lighting up when she saw me. "I was just thinking about you. How are things?" I didn't want to burden her, so I gave her a vague answer about school keeping me busy. I set the groceries on the counter, trying not to think about how much longer we'd even be able to afford weekly trips like this. Just as we started chatting, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. My stomach tightened. Mark was home. He strode into the kitchen, wearing his usual air of smugness. He didn't even look at Grandma, just nodded at me and went straight for the fridge. I didn't plan on saying anything, but something about the way he ignored us pushed me over the edge. "Uncle Mark," I started, my voice steady but soft, "can I ask you something?" He turned, a can of soda in his hand. "What? What happened between you and my parents?" I kept my tone light, as if I didn't already know. He raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I know they asked you for help with the down payment. But now they're acting like they can't even talk to you. Did something happen?" For a moment, he looked caught off guard, like he hadn't expected me to bring it up. Then his expression hardened. "Oh, that," he said, leaning against the counter. "Yeah, your parents thought they could guilt-trip me into giving them my hard-earned money. Like it's my fault they've been renting for decades instead of buying a place like normal people." I felt my cheeks flush. "That's not fair. You know why they've been struggling." "Spare me," he interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "Your dad's been milking your mom for years. She works herself to the bone while he sits around, pretending to be a saint because he had cancer. And don't even get me started on her. Spending all that money on him instead of saving for her own future? Idiotic. Don't talk about my parents like that," I snapped, my voice trembling. Mark smirked, as if he found my anger amusing. "Oh, come on. You know I'm right. They're a mess, and now they're paying the price. They deserve everything that's happening to them. Maybe it'll teach them some responsibility for once." "Enough." Grandma's voice cracked through the room like a whip. She hadn't spoken much during the exchange, but now she was glaring at Mark, her frail frame trembling with anger. "Don't you dare speak about your sister and her husband like that. They've been through enough without you piling on." Mark looked taken aback, but he quickly shrugged it off, muttering something about sensitive people. I couldn't stay any longer. "I'm leaving," I said, grabbing my bag. "Good," Mark called after me. "Maybe you'll learn something too." I walked home that day with my fists clenched and my mind racing. I wasn't angry that Mark hadn't helped financially, no one is obligated to share their money. What infuriated me was how he had humiliated my parents, tearing them down when they were already at their lowest. That night, I made a decision. If no one else was going to help us, then I would. I started selling anything I didn't need, old clothes, books, even some of the jewelry I'd gotten for birthdays over the years. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Then I began looking into freelance work. I dabbled in graphic design as a hobby, so I signed up for online platforms and started taking on small jobs. Designing logos, editing photos, whatever I could manage between school and studying. I didn't tell my parents what I was doing. They had enough on their plate. But every dollar I earned felt like a small victory, a step closer to proving that we could make it without someone like Mark. About 2 weeks later, something unexpected happened. Dad came home from running errands with a strange look on his face. He seemed lighter, almost hopeful, but I couldn't figure out why until he sat us down at the kitchen table. "I ran into an old friend today," he began, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It turned out that one of Dad's closest friends from his younger years, Mike, had moved abroad a long time ago. They'd lost touch over the years, but Mike was visiting the city and had reached out to catch up. "He invited me out for coffee," Dad continued. "We talked for hours, just like old times. And when I told him what's been going on with us, he offered to help." Mom's eyes widened. "Help? How?" "He said he'd lend us the $7,000 we need for the down payment," Dad said, his voice breaking slightly. "No strings attached. He trusts us to pay it back when we can. I stared at him, barely processing the words. After everything, after Mark's cruelty and the weeks of feeling hopeless, someone had stepped in. Someone who actually cared. Tears welled up in Mom's eyes, and she reached across the table to squeeze Dad's hand. For the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope in the room. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a simmering anger that refused to fade. Mark might think we deserve our struggles, but he was wrong. We didn't need him. We never did. We were going to make it, with or without him. And one day, when we were back on our feet, I'd make sure he realized just how wrong he was. I thought I'd feel relief once things started falling into place. Dad's friend Mike had been a miracle in human form, swooping in with the exact amount of help we needed when we had nowhere else to turn. For the first time in weeks, my parents could talk about the future without sounding defeated. But for me, the damage was already done. Mark's words lingered in my mind like an old wound that refused to heal. I replayed the scene in Grandma's kitchen more times than I could count, his cruel smirk, his dismissive tone, the absolute venom in the way he said you deserve this. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about what he had said, what he had meant. I knew I'd never forgive him. Not for this. A few nights later, I overheard my parents talking in the living room. They didn't think I could hear them, but their voices carried through the thin apartment walls. Maybe we should just let it go, Mom said softly. What? Dad sounded incredulous. Mark. The way he acted, it was wrong, but he's still my brother. We can't carry this anger forever. He humiliated us, Laura. He kicked us while we were down. I know, Mom said, her voice wavering. But holding on to this will only hurt us more. We're family. And family forgives. I wanted to storm into the room and tell her she was wrong. That Mark didn't deserve forgiveness, not after what he'd done. But I didn't. This wasn't my fight. Not really. Still, it made my stomach churn to hear her say those words. Despite everything, I kept visiting Grandma every week. It was harder now, knowing that Mark was always lurking somewhere in the house. I hated the way he looked at me when we crossed paths, like he was daring me to say something. I ignored him every time. Grandma was always grateful for my visits. You're the only one who looks out for me, she'd say, patting my hand. I'd smile and tell her it was no trouble, but the truth was, I needed these visits as much as she did. They reminded me that not everyone in our family was like Mark. One afternoon, while I was helping her rearrange some books in the living room, she surprised me. Your uncle, she began, her voice heavy, has been a great disappointment to me. I stopped mid-step, unsure if I'd heard her right. Grandma rarely criticized anyone, least of all her son. What do you mean? I asked cautiously. She sighed, sinking into her favorite chair. I raised him to be better than this. Better than what he's become. Grandma, I didn't know what to say. I heard how he spoke to your mother, she continued, her voice trembling. And to you. He has no right. None at all. I sat down across from her, suddenly feeling like a child again. Why don't you say something to him? She looked at me, her eyes filled with sadness. Because he wouldn't listen. He's stubborn, just like his father was. But that doesn't mean I don't see what's happening. Or that I agree with it. Hearing her say that felt like a small weight lifting off my chest. At least someone else in the family understood. As the weeks went on, I tried to follow my parents' example. They had decided to forgive Mark, at least outwardly, though I could tell it wasn't easy for either of them. Mom still tensed up every time his name came up, and Dad refused to discuss him altogether. But I couldn't let it go. It wasn't just that Mark hadn't helped us when we needed him most. It was the way he had spoken about my parents, like they were nothing, like they deserved to suffer. That wasn't something I could forgive, no matter how much time passed. Maybe that made me stubborn too. Maybe it meant I was holding on to bitterness that would only hurt me in the long run. But I couldn't help it. I wasn't like my parents. I wasn't sure I ever could be. We moved into our new apartment a month later. It was smaller than our old place, but it was ours. The walls didn't have peeling paint, and the floors didn't creak with every step. For the first time in years, my parents looked genuinely happy. Life went on. I kept working my freelance jobs and saving as much as I could. My parents began repaying Mike in small installments, grateful for his trust and generosity. As for Mark, he stayed exactly the same. He didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge what had happened. And I didn't expect him to. But every time I visited Grandma, she'd slip in a quiet comment about him, how selfish he was, how ashamed she felt. I knew she loved him, but even she couldn't ignore the truth. I just wish he'd see the error of his ways, she said one day, her voice tinged with regret. But some people never do. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything. Because deep down, I knew she was right. Sadly, a few months later, Grandma passed away. Everyone knew she had heart problems, but we all thought she'd have more time. Her passing left a hole in our hearts that seemed impossible to fill. For weeks, we were all in a daze, numb from the shock and loss. It wasn't supposed to happen this way, not so suddenly. But life, as it does, moved on. 2 months after the funeral, my parents received a call from a lawyer. They were asked to come in to read Grandma's will. We were all a bit nervous, unsure of what to expect, but we knew one thing for sure: Mark would be there, and he would likely be the one to inherit everything. When we arrived, the lawyer led us into a small conference room where Mark was already seated. His smile was wide, almost smug, and I could see the glint of anticipation in his eyes. He was certain he'd be the one to walk away with the apartment. But when the lawyer started reading the will, the unexpected happened. To Mark's complete shock, the apartment was left to me. The reason was clear: I had been the one who was closest to her in her final years. The will then outlined that the small sum of money Grandma had saved up would be split equally between my parents and Mark. It was just enough to give them a fresh start, along with enough left over for Mark to use as a down payment on his own place. Mark's face twisted with anger. "This is ridiculous. I'm the one who's been here for years, and I get nothing." His voice rose, and his words were venomous. "This isn't fair. I'm not going to sit here and let a child have everything while I get nothing." I stayed calm, the weight of my own emotions buried deep. "You have until the end of the month to move out," I told him quietly. Mark's face darkened. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You can't just throw me out on the street. We're family." I didn't flinch. "So, we're family only when it suits you, right?" His expression faltered for just a second, but then he stood up, muttering under his breath as he stormed out of the room. Months passed, and life slowly found a new rhythm. I moved into Grandma's apartment. A place that had once felt like a refuge now became my own home. It was bittersweet, but I knew I had to make it mine. I worked harder than ever, focusing on my freelance career, and kept the apartment in order, doing what Grandma wished. Meanwhile, my parents had reluctantly agreed to let Mark stay with them temporarily. They wanted to help him, despite everything, but it didn't take long for Mark's behavior to make their decision clear. He refused to respect their space, barging into their lives, telling them how things should be done, as if his opinion was the only one that mattered. The final straw came when he started badmouthing me, calling me disrespectful, accusing me of taking everything from him. My parents didn't say much at first, but I knew it was only a matter of time. The situation became unbearable. My parents gave Mark an ultimatum: either respect their home or leave. A few weeks later, he was gone. He found a small apartment to rent, the same as always, scraping by, never having truly committed to anything. As for his business? Still no sign of it. I didn't know if he'd ever get around to it. Looking back, I realized that things would never be the same. Mark had made his choices, and I had made mine. In the end, my parents forgave him. I couldn't. But that didn't mean we couldn't find peace in our own way. Now, as I sit in my own home, I think of Grandma. The apartment feels like a tribute to her, not just in the way it holds memories, but in the way it has given me a chance to stand on my own, to find my own way in a world that can sometimes feel cold and unforgiving. The family I have now is the one I've built for myself, with the love and respect I know I deserve. And while I may never fully forgive Mark, I've learned to let go of the anger. It doesn't serve me. What matters is the life I'm creating, the lessons I've learned, and the family I choose to surround myself with. And as I sat in her favorite chair one evening, sipping tea and watching the city lights twinkle outside, I realized I finally understood what she had always told me. Family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up when it matters.